We argued in a previous series that the apocalypse, or the events of the Second Coming, would be, in part, a repetition of the Exodus. We made this claim on the basis of a revelation to Joseph Smith in 1834, which plainly states that the redemption of Zion in the latter days would be conducted by a latter-day Moses, who would lead Israel from bondage as did the ancient Moses. But it's not the only scriptural evidence that the Apocalypse and Exodus are, in nature, parallel events. It has long been recognized by scholars within and without of the church that the exodus of the Israelites under the leadership of Moses served as a symbolic type. The Apostle Paul, for example, used several events of the Exodus to typify Christ. He called the events examples of our admonition. Jesus used the manna of the Exodus to typify himself, giving it as a sign to his disciples. The Book of Mormon repeatedly uses the Exodus as a type, as Professor S. Kent Brown explains. Nephi used the example of Moses parting the Red Sea and drowning Pharaoh's armies to typify the Lord's ability to deliver himself and his brethren from Laban. Nephi later recounted the events of the Exodus when chastising them for their lack of faith. The redemption of Zion of our dispensation follows the same type, where modern Israel must be freed from bondage with power and led to a promised land flowing with milk and honey. The redemption of Zion, as the latter-day Exodus is called by the Lord, does more than follow the symbolic pattern of the Mosaic Exodus. It will be a faithful replay of the first event. Events in the Exodus will repeat in type and in sequence. Many of the same actors will participate, while others will be represented by proxies. The presence of the Lord will return. The original rod of Aaron will be used by a latter-day Aaron. Latter-day Israel will be released from the bondage of a modern-day Egypt and led to a promised land. It should not be surprising, therefore, that the account of the redemption, the book of Revelation, duplicates the narrative of the first Exodus, the book of Exodus, in structure and content. The Rabbinical Talmud says that the first redemption and the last redemption will be the same or alike. The first redemption was the Exodus under Moses, and the final redemption will be in the end times under the Messiah. The events of the second coming are known as a second Exodus, where the Lord will recover His people a second time from bondage. Of course, the two events will not be exactly the same, but they will be remarkably similar. The account in Revelation bears this out, describing a series of events that duplicate those in the book of Exodus. As we chronicle the events of both the first and second Exodus in the book of Exodus and the book of Revelation in this series, the deep correspondence will become clear. For now, we will simply point out the most obvious parallel events. The Moses Exodus story begins with the Lord's people, Israel, in bondage to Egypt. In Revelation, the Lord's people, the saints, are in bondage to the worldly power, called Babylon the Great. The Lord commands people to come out from the city. Like in the first Exodus, the Lord promises to destroy Babylon, the new Egypt, with plagues. In the original Exodus, Moses and Aaron, using the power of God primarily in the form of a rod, inflict Egypt with 10 devastating plagues. In Revelation, the Lord pours out 7 vials of the wrath of God. The plagues, or judgments upon the earth, in many cases, are repetitions of the plagues upon Egypt. After the plagues had forced Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, the nation departed into the wilderness. Now, in Revelation, the woman, representing the church, fled into the wilderness, where she was fed by God, in likeness to God feeding the Israelites with manna. After the drowning of Pharaoh's armies in the Red Sea, Moses and the Israelites rejoiced, singing what is named the Song of the Sea, or the Song of Moses. This song is to be sung again by the 7 angels with the 7 last plagues. They rejoiced at the victory over the beast. Perhaps the crowning event of the Exodus was the building and dedication of the tabernacle, a place where God's presence could dwell among them. The crowning event of the apocalypse is the descent of the holy city, the New Jerusalem, from heaven and the opening of the heavenly tabernacle. God will dwell with His people forever. A second Exodus requires a second Moses. Now, there is no doubt who this second Moses will be. In Jewish tradition, it will be the Messiah. For Christians, it will also be the Messiah, who is Jesus Christ, as the singing of the Song of the Lamb along with the Song of Moses in John's Apocalypse makes clear. The beginning of the tradition that the Messiah will be a second Moses who leads a second Exodus in the end times begins, appropriately enough, when the future second Moses, the pre-mortal Jesus Christ, tells the first Moses of the rising up of the future prophet like unto him. During the middle of giving Moses the laws that were to govern Israel in the Promised Land, the Lord inserted the prophecy of a future prophet. This prophet was to be like Moses and was to be obeyed or stand condemned. For the Jewish rabbis, the identity of this prophet is in dispute, with a variety of propositions offered. Yet we know from statements in the New Testament that the Jews of Jesus' time understood the statement in Deuteronomy to refer to the Messiah. The Savior spoke plainly to the Jews who sought to destroy him for healing on the Sabbath. He pointed out that Moses would accuse them for rejecting him because it was Moses who wrote of him. Jesus used Moses' prophecy of the Messiah as a proof, knowing that the Jews would understand. The Apostle Peter understood the prophecy and ascribed Moses' prophet to be Christ. Latter-day Saints have more reason to support the identification of Jesus Christ as the unnamed prophet with three additional witnesses. The Book of Mormon prophet, Nephi, speaking to his brothers, named the prophet as the Holy One of Israel, referring to Jesus Christ. The Savior himself openly declared himself as that prophet to the Nephites. He confirmed his own original prophecy. Finally, when Moroni appeared to Joseph Smith, among other prophecies, he cited the prophecy of Moses to the young boy and declared that prophet was Christ. For Jesus Christ to become a second Moses, he had to imitate the prophet in a real sense, or the prophecy would be empty. And when the lives of the two prophets are placed side by side, as many commentators have done, the number of parallels are astonishing, and the parallels themselves are dramatic. We share several of the most important parallels. As we noted in our previous episode, Moses and Jesus shared many parallel events in their lives, and we continue these parallels, ending with the most important: both prophets were liberators. The failure of the saints of Joseph Smith's time to redeem Zion and the continued failure of the saints up to the present day make it necessary for the Lord to fulfill the task himself. This he has promised to do, and to do so with great power. The extent and nature of the power promised by the Lord is not fully understood by modern man. They will not be expecting what is to come. It will be so awe-inspiring and unexpected that men's hearts will fail them. The Lord has warned his saints to not lose heart. He has attempted to prepare them repeatedly with graphic accounts of the calamities that will come. The book of Revelation is only one such warning. The Lord has described the plagues that will come upon the earth in many of the revelations to Joseph Smith as well. Even so, the events will be well beyond the experience or even imagination of modern men, including the saints. But the ancients fully understood the nature of what will come. They experienced every manner of plague and scourge which will fall upon mankind at the second coming. The direct connection between the Exodus and the Apocalypse provides a firm basis on which to understand both events. The connection allows a comparison between the two, where a more complete and transparent description of an event during one could shed light on the same event in the other, and vice versa. The primary reason for the similarity of the catastrophes in the Exodus and Apocalypse is the fact that both were caused by the same agent. The Scriptures have identified this agent as the angel of the presence of the Lord. The psalmist David recorded in one of his psalms that it was the presence of the Lord, meaning the angel of the presence of the Lord, which parted the Red Sea and later the Jordan River. David made an important point that the Exodus was not a local event confined to Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. The entire earth trembled at the presence of the Lord. The Exodus was a global event. This should be expected because its sister event, the Apocalypse of the Second Coming, will also be worldwide. The angel of the presence of the Lord will also be the agent for the destructions of the Second Coming. The Lord stated as much in a revelation to Joseph Smith. In another series, we have identified this angel as the planet Mars. Though the Mosaic accounts are not explicit on this identification, the revelation of John names the angel openly. The angel of the bottomless pit is Apollyon in the Greek. Apollyon is more readily recognized as Apollo, which was the Greek name for the planet god Mars. All the calamities of the Exodus and Second Coming can be traced back directly to the Red Planet. Whenever Mars descends towards Earth, bad things happen. Much has been written about the Exodus and its plagues. Unfortunately, the discussion has brought little enlightenment, let alone consensus, as to the nature of what happened, if anything. Immanuel Velikovsky had it right when he stated that believers merely attribute the plagues to God's incomprehensible power without explanation, and that scholars either affix non-miraculous naturalistic causes or dismiss them entirely as myth. Neither side is helpful. If the plagues were acts of an all-powerful God and beyond the mental scope of mankind, then there is nothing to explain. Indeed, the Church has given up any attempt to explain them rationally. The plagues are simply miracles, and that is the end of it. Some scholars attempt to explain each plague as the result of a natural disaster. But natural disasters are not acts of God. To suggest such explanations is to deny the participation of God and the existence of the miraculous. Without God and the miraculous, the whole point of the biblical narrative collapses. Either the narrative is to be believed and addressed on its own terms or not. Unbelieving historians summarily dismiss the plagues as myth. The story of the Exodus does have mythic elements. Like other important gospel events, the planetary archetypes of the prophetic tradition were used to prefigure the redemption of Israel through Moses. But the existence of the mythic types found throughout the world does not make the Exodus or the plagues unhistorical. The plagues were real. The world, including the church, cannot find reasonable explanation for some or all of the plagues, and even declares the effort to be impossible. Yet the plagues were real physical events and are, therefore, physically explainable. But to do so, we must rid ourselves of the shackles of unwarranted assumptions and unsupported historical and scientific paradigms. The plagues, as described, clearly belong outside our experience. Accordingly, we must discard what we think we know and seek answers outside what we consider the norm. We must discard history and science as we think we know it. The most famous of the plagues is the first one. With the aid of the rod, Moses and Aaron changed the waters of Egypt to blood. The Lord told Moses that he was to use the rod to curse the river, a reference to the Nile, and to inform Pharaoh why he was doing this. Aaron was instructed to curse all the waters of Egypt. Moses and Aaron did as they were commanded, and all the waters of Egypt became blood. Historians and biblical scholars have proposed several naturalistic explanations for the first plague. The most widely accepted theory is that the reddening of Egypt's waters was caused by the spread of red-colored algae. The Church does not accept this or other naturalistic explanations, preferring to rely upon the mysterious and miraculous power of God. Notwithstanding the Church's belief that the plagues are unexplainable, there is a way to reliably identify the cause and method of the rivers of blood. The book of Revelation holds the key to the mystery of the plagues. Our thesis is that the Exodus and Apocalypse are similar events with a similar cause. Most of what happened during the time of Moses will occur again when Jesus Christ returns. This is true of the plague of blood. John's Apocalypse records the mirror event of the first plague and does so with great specificity. The future plague will be worldwide and not centered upon one nation, Egypt. According to the Revelator, 1/3 of the sea, referring to the oceans of the world, will become blood. Like the Exodus, the bloody waters of the future plague will kill marine life. Additionally, it will destroy ships. The Mosaic account does not identify the origin of the blood. The rivers and waters simply become blood red when smitten by the rod. John, on the other hand, saw where the blood came from. It came from heaven, mingled with hail and fire. In other words, the blood came from above the earth. It was extraterrestrial, and it was a part of a larger catastrophic event. The direct cause of the reddening of the sea was a great mountain burning with fire. The mountain was cast into the sea. For many mainstream scholars, this can only be a volcano. But within the framework of the polar configuration, which is the basis of John's symbolism, the mountain is something else entirely. Now, before we identify the mountain, however, we must first identify the origin of the cataclysm. John is quite clear on his point. He identifies the ultimate cause of the hail, fire, and blood as a star. Since the star moves and is quite close to Earth, it is in modern terminology a planet.